ceilings, pristine marble floors, a chandelier that resembled a frozen waterfall, and a constant stream of sharply dressed professionals striding purposefully past the revolving glass doors. Security personnel stood like silent sentinels, their eyes trained to spot anything out of place. Nothing unexpected ever happened in this lobby. Until that morning. At precisely 8:37 a.m., a small figure entered the building, alone. She was wearing a navy school cardigan over a white blouse, pleated skirt slightly wrinkled, and scuffed black shoes. A red satchel swung awkwardly from her shoulder, and clutched in her arms was a manila folder nearly as large as her chest. She stood at the reception desk, barely tall enough to see over it. "Excuse me," she said, her voice clear and steady. "I'd like to speak with Mr. Edward Lancaster, please." The receptionist blinked. "I'm sorry, sweetheart. Do you have an appointment?" "No," the girl said, "but it's very important. I'm here to apply for a job. For my mum." That sentence sent a ripple through the air like a stone dropped into still water. The receptionist tried to smile kindly. "You mean your mum has an appointment?" "No," the girl replied again, firmer this time. "She applied, but they rejected her. I think that was a mistake. She's really smart. I brought her resume and some extra things she wrote. I need to speak to Mr. Lancaster." By now, a few people had begun to slow their pace, glancing toward the scene. One young analyst pulled out his phone and began recording. Another whispered, "Is this a prank?" The receptionist hesitated. "Darling, I don't think the CEO sees people without an appointment. Especially not children." The girl straightened. "I know he's busy. But this matters. I read online that he believes in fairness and second chances. So I'm asking for one." There was a pause, and then from behind the security desk, a tall man in a dark suit stepped forward. His name tag read Carl. His face was not unkind, but his posture was firm. "Miss," he said gently, "we can't let visitors into the building without clearance. Maybe you could leave the papers with us, and we'll make sure someone reads them." "No," she said quickly. "People don't read things properly unless you make them care. That's why I need to tell him myself." A short silence followed. Her logic, though childlike, was strangely sound. Carl tilted his head. "And what's your name?" "Eleanor. Eleanor Reed." He paused again. "And your mother?" "Sophie Reed. She's really smart, but she's been sick. She still worked on this even when she was in the hospital." The security guard looked at the receptionist. Something unspoken passed between them. He leaned down, speaking softly. "Eleanor, would you mind waiting here for just a few minutes? I'll make a quick call. No promises, though." She nodded solemnly. Up on the 32nd floor, Edward Lancaster stood in front of the window of his office, a mug of black coffee in one hand, the Financial Times folded under his arm. A sharp knock interrupted the silence. "Come in," he said without turning. Claudia Harper, the company's HR director, entered briskly. "You'll want to see this," she said, handing him her phone. He glanced down. A video was playing, a girl, no older than 8, speaking confidently in the building's lobby. It took him only seconds to recognize the setting, the tone, the quiet intensity in her voice. He turned up the volume. "My mum's been through a lot. But she didn't give up. Even when she was coughing and couldn't get out of bed, she was working on a report about your company. She says numbers don't lie. But sometimes people do. That's why I need to talk to you." Edward froze. "What's her name?" he asked, setting the mug down. "Eleanor Reed," Claudia replied. "Apparently she's here representing her mother. Security called. They thought you should know." Edward's jaw tightened. "Eleanor." It wasn't just the confidence in her voice or the strange sense of purpose she carried. It was the name. His daughter, his own Eleanor, had died 17 years ago in a car accident that had carved a fault line through his life. Since then, he'd buried himself in efficiency, in growth models, in numbers that never betrayed him. He'd long ago trained himself not to flinch at the name Eleanor when he heard it in passing. But this was different. "I'll meet her," he said quietly. Claudia's eyebrows lifted. "Personally?" "Yes." A few minutes later, the elevator doors opened to reveal the small figure standing beside Carl the guard. She looked up, bright-eyed but not intimidated. Edward approached slowly, his features unreadable. "You're Eleanor," he said. "Yes, sir." She held out the folder with both hands. "This is for you." He took it without looking inside. "You know this isn't how job applications usually work, right?" "Yes," she said. "But sometimes usual things don't work. And I couldn't let that stop me." For a moment, he said nothing. Then, glancing at Carl, he nodded toward his office. "She can come up." Claudia's jaw tightened slightly, but she said nothing. The girl followed him into the elevator, red satchel bumping against her leg. Inside his office, Edward opened the folder. There were no crayon drawings.
No emotional, please.
There was a detailed financial breakdown of Sterling and Vale's Q2 earnings, a model identifying inefficiencies in their North American portfolio, and a hand-signed letter from Sophie Reed explaining why she believed she still had value to offer, despite having been out of work for 2 years due to illness and caring for her child alone. Edward read in silence, page after page, the child sitting quietly across the desk. When he finished, he looked up. The girl hadn't moved. "Did you read any of this?" he asked. She nodded. "Some of it. I don't understand all of it yet. But I watched her work on it every night. It made her happy. Like she still mattered." That last line struck something deep in him. He closed the folder, leaned back, and studied the ceiling for a long moment. "Your mother," he said slowly, "isn't the only one who's been underestimated." He glanced at the girl. "I can't promise anything. But I'll speak to HR." Eleanor smiled for the first time. "Thank you, sir." And just like that, a fault line inside him began to shift, quietly, unexpectedly. Not because of data. Not because of reports. But because an 8-year-old walked into his building and reminded him that some voices, however small, still mattered. Sophie Reed sat propped up in a hospital bed, the fluorescent light above her head buzzing faintly. A tray of untouched soup rested on the table beside her, growing cold. Her laptop, an aging model covered in worn stickers, lay closed on her lap. She stared blankly at the muted television mounted in the corner, but her mind was far away. Outside the window, rain patterned softly against the glass. She had always loved rain. It made the world quieter, softer somehow. Today, though, it just felt heavy. The door opened gently. She turned her head, expecting a nurse. Instead, a tall man in a charcoal gray coat stepped inside, carrying a familiar manila folder in one hand and a paper coffee cup in the other. Edward Lancaster. She recognized him immediately from news articles, investor presentations, and quarterly earnings reports, the man whose signature she had studied dozens of times across merger documents and financial disclosures. She struggled to sit up straighter. "Mr. Lancaster?" He nodded. "Sophie Reed." She offered a weak smile. "Well, this is a surprise." Edward crossed the room, placed the coffee on the bedside table, and held out the folder. "I believe your daughter delivered this to me this morning." Sophie's cheeks flushed. "I'm so sorry. I didn't know she was planning that. I told her." He raised a hand gently. "You don't need to apologize. She was impressive. Direct. Persuasive. She might have a future in boardrooms." Sophie exhaled, her shoulders slumping. "She's always been that way. After her father left, she sort of grew up faster than she should have." Edward sat in the chair beside the bed, folding his coat across his lap. For a moment he simply observed her, how her collarbones protruded beneath the hospital gown, how her eyes, though tired, still held focus. "I read your analysis," he said. "It was detailed, methodical. You even cited our internal Q2 discrepancies and made predictive models. Not exactly bedtime reading." She allowed herself a small laugh. "It was my way of staying sharp. I can't afford a job gap to mean I've lost relevance." Edward leaned back. "Your CV says you worked at Morgan & Grant?" 6 years. I left after Eleanor was born. My husband wasn't prepared for fatherhood, or for me to continue working." He nodded slowly. "It happens." Sophie hesitated. "I know how it looks. Single mother. Big corporation. Emotional appeal. But I didn't ask for this chance because I'm struggling." I asked because I can still contribute. Edward looked down at the folder again. Why Sterling and Vale? She didn't blink. Because your firm is one of the few that claims to invest in potential, not just performance. I wanted to see if that was still true. He let the silence linger. Outside, a gust of wind rattled the windows. Finally, he said, when you applied to our junior strategist position last year, your file was rejected by HR before it ever reached my desk. She nodded. I know. Claudia Hopper believes employment gaps are red flags. She values consistency. Sophie met his gaze. Consistency is easy when life's easy. But resilience? That's a better predictor of success. Edward studied her for a long moment. His mind flicked back to Eleanor, his Eleanor, the girl he had buried alongside his wife 17 years ago after a car crash on a rainy November morning. She would have been 25 now. Maybe sitting across from a boardroom like this woman. Maybe writing financial models. Maybe handing out manila folders of her own. He blinked the memory away. I'm not going to make any promises, he said finally. But we have a temporary opening on the risk analysis team. Contract, 3 months. You'd be evaluated like any other hire. Sophie's eyes widened, but she stayed still. Understood. No special treatment, he added. She nodded. I don't need special. Just fair. Edward stood. You'll hear from HR tomorrow. He turned to leave, but paused at the door. Your daughter, he said, she didn't ask for sympathy. She asked for consideration. That takes a kind of clarity most adults lack. Sophie looked down at her hands. She doesn't want me to give up. So I won't. He nodded once and left. The room felt quieter after he was gone, but Sophie didn't return to the television. She opened her laptop instead and began reviewing the latest industry benchmarks. She wasn't just preparing for a job. She was preparing to re-enter a world that had forgotten her, and to make them remember. The next morning, the HR office at Sterling and Vale buzzed with subdued tension. Claudia Hopper stood at the window of her corner office, arms folded. Her assistant hovered near the door. You're saying he personally offered her a contract? Yes, ma'am, the assistant confirmed. 3 months. Risk Analysis Division. Claudia's jaw tightened. She had read Sophie Reed's file. Good grades. Solid experience. Then a 6-year absence. A child. An unstable personal history. She had stamped reject on that file without a second thought. Now that woman was bypassing her department completely, brought in under the CEO's wing. She's not going to last, Claudia muttered. These comeback stories always sound better than they are. But even as she said it, a chill crept into her voice. Because she knew something the others didn't. This wasn't the first time Sophie Reed had tried to get into Sterling and Vale. 5 years ago, she had applied under a different name, Sophie Carroll, her maiden name. Claudia had rejected that application too. On principle. Claudia prided herself on building an elite, uncompromising team.
No exceptions.
No second chances. And now the woman she dismissed twice was coming in the front door, escorted by fate, or pity, or both. She turned to her assistant. Keep an eye on her. Every report. Every metric. I want to see exactly how long she lasts before she folds. Down in the subway, Sophie and Eleanor sat side by side on a bench, both wearing coats too thin for the cold wind that blew through the platform. You really got the job? Eleanor asked, eyes wide. Sort of, Sophie replied, squeezing her hand. It's a test run. I have 3 months to prove myself. Eleanor grinned. That's all you need. Sophie smiled, looking down the tunnel. 3 months. 3 months to prove she still had value. 3 months to change the minds of people who had already made up theirs. And for the first time in years, the challenge didn't scare her. It thrilled her. Because this time, she wasn't walking in alone. She was walking in with purpose. And purpose, she had learned, could be louder than any title. Sterling and Vale's 24th floor was quiet in a calculated way, like a museum of ambition. The desks were sleek, the lighting sharp, and every wall was made of glass. No one raised their voice. No one slouched. And no one, it seemed, ever took their eyes off their screens. Sophie Reed stepped out of the elevator, clutching a slim black notebook and wearing her only tailored blazer, recently let out at the seams. Her ID badge hung awkwardly from a bright blue lanyard, standard issue for new hires. A few heads turned as she passed, but no one greeted her. She was escorted by a junior admin named Jules, barely out of university and rehearsing politeness like a second language. "Your desk is here," Jules said, pointing to a station wedged between two senior analysts. "They've assigned you to Project Atlas, a risk review on the Gemini Syntech merger. High priority. Tight deadline." Sophie nodded, setting her bag down. "They also asked me to remind you there's a policy on personal phone use and desk clutter. You'll find it in the handbook." With a tight smile, Jules walked off, heels clicking against the tile. Sophie took a deep breath and sat. The terminal booted slowly. She glanced at the glass walls around her. Everyone looked as if they belonged, expensive watches, smooth banter, spreadsheets like second nature. Her palms were sweating. To her left sat a man in his early 30s with hair too neat to be accidental. He didn't look up, but his tone was practiced when he spoke. "You're the contract hire, right?" Sophie turned. "That's right. Sophie Reed." He finally looked at her. "Daniel Wells. I'm lead on Atlas." "Nice to meet you," she said. He nodded once, without smiling. "Deadline's Friday. 5 days. Claudia wants full risk mapping, impact modeling, plus mitigation scenarios. We're behind already." Sophie opened her notebook. "Where should I start?" He gestured at the shared folder on the screen. "Start by reading. The numbers speak first." That was fine by her. She trusted numbers more than people. Hours passed. Sophie barely looked up. She read everything: past performance reports, audit trails, merger contracts. When the screen blurred, she blinked hard and kept going. By early afternoon, she had flagged 6 inconsistencies in the Gemini subsidiary disclosures, nothing catastrophic, but enough to raise questions. She added comments, drafted a quick note, and sent it to Daniel. No response. At 5, most of the floor packed up. Coats slung over chairs, muted conversations about yoga or dinner reservations drifted through the air. Sophie kept typing. At 7:15, Daniel reappeared at her desk, holding a printed copy of her notes. "You caught this?" Sophie nodded. Some things didn't add up. The Q3 numbers looked inflated. "Might be a reporting lag, but it's worth checking." He stared at the page. "You used to be at Morgan & Grant?" "Yes." "And then?" "Family. Illness. Life." He didn't press. "Okay. Keep going." When he walked away, Sophie allowed herself the smallest smile. Progress. In another part of the building, Claudia Hopper stood in front of a large wall monitor, watching a data dashboard scroll across the screen. She was tall, with platinum blonde hair and a taste for monochrome suits. Her office had no photos, no books, just awards and a flawless view of the Thames. Her assistant, Lena, entered quietly. "Update on Reed?" Claudia turned. "Yes." She flagged 6 issues in the Gemini file. Daniel seems impressed. Claudia's jaw clenched. "Keep monitoring. Pull her time stamps. I want to know if she's working after hours." "Is that a problem?" "It's an indicator. People who overcompensate usually burn out fast." Lena hesitated. "She's only been here 1 day." Claudia gave her a cold smile. "And that's all it takes to start slipping." The rest of the week passed in a rhythm Sophie hadn't felt in years. Work. Home. Eleanor. Repeat. Each morning, she kissed her daughter goodbye with a packed lunch and an encouraging smile, then headed into a world that barely acknowledged her. Each night, she reviewed market trends while Eleanor slept beside her on the couch. She didn't talk much at work. She didn't go to lunch. She didn't linger in the hallways. But the numbers, those she understood. On Thursday, Daniel forwarded her a request from Edward Lancaster himself, an executive summary of the Gemini risk profile before the board reviewed it on Monday. Sophie worked until almost 10 that night. On Friday morning, Edward read her summary and made no comment. But during a meeting with the legal department, he quoted one of her risk assessments verbatim.
Word spread. She's the one who caught the data mismatch. She's ex-Morgan and Grant. Didn't she take 6 years off? No one just comes back after that. By noon, the whispers reached Claudia Harper. She called Daniel to her office. How's the temp? Daniel leaned against the wall, arms crossed. Competent. Quiet. Obsessive in a useful way. She's not struggling? She's outperforming your full-timers. Claudia didn't flinch. Let's see how long that lasts.
That evening, as Sophie packed up her things, Amira Patel, data analyst, known for her quick wit and ethical spine, approached her desk.
You're Sophie, right? Sophie looked up, surprised. Yes. Amira smiled.
Just wanted to say your comments on the Gemini case were sharp. That clause you flagged saved us a weekend's worth of cleanup.
Thank you. I wasn't sure anyone noticed. We noticed. Some of us, anyway.
They exchanged a nod, something quiet but meaningful. Sophie left the office as the sky turned a dusky lavender. On the train home, she closed her eyes for a moment. The ache in her shoulders was familiar, but this time, it wasn't from worry. It was from doing what she loved. At home, Eleanor was already in pajamas, curled up with a book. Did they like your work today? She asked.
Sophie smiled. They didn't say much. But I think I made a dent. Eleanor grinned. Dents become doors. That's what you told me. I did, didn't I? She kissed her daughter's forehead. 1 week down.
And for the first time in years, the glass walls didn't feel so impenetrable. The following Monday arrived with rain, a slow, steady downpour that painted the city in shades of slate and silver. From the 24th floor of Sterling and Vale, the world looked blurred and half-formed, as if someone had smeared the skyline with a wet brush. But inside the glass walls, the atmosphere was crystal clear, tense, expectant, and unusually quiet. Sophie Reed sat at her desk before 8, having arrived early once again. The office hadn't yet filled with the typical low hum of typing, footsteps, and clipped conversation. She preferred this hour, when the silence belonged to her, and the only thing speaking was the data on her screen. She was reviewing her latest revision of the Gemini risk assessment when her inbox chimed. It was from Edward Lancaster's executive assistant. 3 words, board review today. Sophie's fingers froze over the keyboard. She knew her report had been well received. She had double-checked every assumption, every footnote. But knowing a dozen board members were about to review something she'd written, after just 1 week back in the financial world, made her chest tighten. She took a breath, clicked her pen twice, and went back to work. At 9:15, Daniel approached her desk. They're calling you in, he said. Briefing meeting. 10 minutes. She blinked. Me? He gave a rare half-smile. You're the one who wrote the model. They want you to walk them through it. Sophie stood slowly, heart thudding. She smoothed her blazer and picked up her notepad. Her shoes echoed softly as she followed him down the hallway to a small conference room just outside the main boardroom. Inside, Edward stood near a whiteboard, arms folded. Claudia Harper sat opposite him, tablet in hand, lips pursed. Jonathan Clay, the chief operating officer, was there too, tall and lean, with the calculating stillness of someone who knew how to let others speak first. Ms. Reed, Edward said, motioning toward a chair. Let's walk through your summary. Sophie nodded, opened her notes, and began. Her voice was calm, practiced. She started with the surface-level risk factors, vendor volatility, international compliance gaps, post-merger operational redundancies. Then she moved deeper, flagging a critical clause in the Gemini Syntec agreement that, if triggered, could result in a £40 million liability over 2 years. This clause, she said, pointing to the screen behind her, was tucked inside a revised appendix that never received independent legal review. It was quietly folded into the third amendment of the M&A draft. Edward raised his eyebrows slightly. And how did you catch it? I compared the original document line by line with the latest draft, she said. The amendment shifted the language subtly, enough that it wouldn't raise a red flag unless you knew what to look for. Jonathan Clay leaned forward. That's a level of scrutiny we don't often see in contractors. Sophie kept her expression neutral. I'm aware.
And your recommendation? Claudia asked, her tone measured. Renegotiate the clause before signing. Insist on legal transparency across all addenda. Otherwise, the reputational damage will outweigh the projected gains. A silence followed. Edward broke it. Thank you, Ms. Reed. You may return to your station. Sophie stood. Of course. As she left the room, she heard Jonathan say, low and amused, we should keep her on retainer. Outside, Daniel waited by the door. Well, he asked. I think I survived. You didn't just survive, he said. You turned a pitfall into leverage. Don't act surprised when people notice. But she didn't feel triumphant. She felt watched.
Later that afternoon, Claudia Harper met with Jonathan Clay in her office, her blinds drawn for privacy.
She's good, Claudia said, arms crossed. Too good. Jonathan shrugged. That's not a crime, Claudia. It's what we hire for.
You and I both know she wasn't vetted the usual way. Lancaster brought her in through the side door.
Jonathan chuckled. You sound bitter. I sound cautious, Claudia snapped. I rejected her file twice in 5 years. Gaps in employment. Lack of recent references. She shouldn't have passed screening.
Jonathan leaned back in his chair, folding his hands.
And yet she found a loophole.
Just like she found the one in the merger documents.
Claudia narrowed her eyes. She's making you look bad. She's making us all look replaceable.
They sat in silence for a moment.
Then Claudia spoke again. I want to test her. Jonathan tilted his head. Go on.
I want to see if she knows how to navigate corporate culture, not just numbers. We bring her into the internal compliance audit.
Something bureaucratic. Political.
Let's see how she handles pressure when it's not just data but people.
Jonathan considered it. And if she fails?
We'll say the trial period didn't work out. Lancaster can't argue with due process.
Fine, Jonathan said. But make it subtle.
No one wants another social media firestorm. That evening, Sophie sat in the kitchen of their small flat in Southwark, reviewing notes while Eleanor scribbled on construction paper beside her.
Are the grown-ups being nice to you? Eleanor asked, without looking up. Sophie smiled faintly. Some of them. And the others? They're watching me. Eleanor paused her drawing. Do they think you can't do it? Maybe.
Or maybe they're waiting to see if I'll quit.
Eleanor tilted her head. But you won't. No, Sophie said. I won't.
Eleanor smiled, content, and returned to her drawing. Sophie looked down at her laptop. Her inbox had just received a new calendar invite, internal compliance review, preliminary meeting, Thursday, 11 a.m.
She knew what that meant. A test. A shift from analysis to politics.
They were moving the game.
That was fine. She could learn to play.
After all, surviving motherhood, illness and isolation had taught her more about diplomacy and crisis management than any corporate training manual ever could. She reached over and gently tucked a strand of hair behind Eleanor's ear.
Thank you, she whispered. For what? For reminding me that I'm still in this. And she was.
Not because someone had given her a chance, but because she had refused to stop asking for one. By Wednesday morning, the tension inside Sterling and Vale was no longer confined to boardrooms and private meetings. It began to hum in the hallways, linger in break rooms, and buzz in the minds of employees who kept one eye on their work and the other on the company's name trending online. At 9:02 a.m., a junior analyst named Oliver Marks burst into Amira Patel's cubicle, phone in hand.
Have you seen this? Amira looked up, slightly annoyed. What? He handed her the phone.
A video played, a clip of Eleanor Reed in the lobby, the same one that had gone viral days ago.
But this version was edited. The pacing was faster. Music had been added.
The tone was different, no longer earnest and heartwarming, but mocking.
Text overlays flashed on the screen. 8-year-old job seeker, inspirational or manipulated? Then, corporate PR stunt or desperate parenting? The final caption lingered longest. She's 8. Not your spokesperson. Amira's face hardened. Who posted this? An account called Corporate Takedown UK. They have almost 500,000 followers. She handed the phone back. That account always stirs controversy. But this is different. This feels orchestrated. Elsewhere on the floor, the video spread like fire. Slack messages pinged. Screens flashed. Quiet gasps and raised eyebrows began to ripple through departments. Some were confused. Others were amused. But a few, particularly those who had started to admire Sophie, looked unsettled. Downstairs, in the executive suite, Claudia Harper stood beside Edward Lancaster's desk, phone in hand. "This just hit 500,000 views," she said. "Comments are pouring in." Edward didn't look at the screen. "What's the ratio?" "Negative. 2/3 critical, 1/3 supportive. It's already in Reddit threads, LinkedIn discussions, even a few parenting forums. People are questioning whether Eleanor was exploited." "Was she?" Claudia hesitated. "That depends on your definition." Edward finally looked up. "Define it for me." Claudia set her jaw. "You let an emotionally charged situation bypass our standard vetting process. Now, the media has weaponized it. They're not just questioning the mother. They're questioning your judgment." He said nothing for a moment. Then quietly, "I thought we agreed not to weaponize children." "I didn't post it."
No.
"But you're benefiting from it." Claudia straightened. "This is about company optics, Edward. If public sentiment turns, we need to act fast. Suspend the contract. Let it die quietly." Edward folded his hands. "And if we're wrong?" Claudia didn't blink. "Then it's still better than being late." Sophie knew something had shifted the moment she entered the office. People avoided eye contact. Conversations halted when she passed. The air was heavy, like before a storm. At her desk, she opened her inbox. 23 unread messages. One from HR, urgent, meeting request, 10 a.m. She clicked it open. No details. Just a conference room number and a note, "Bring your personal belongings." Her stomach dropped. She glanced toward Amira, who was watching her with quiet concern. "I think something's happening," Sophie said, her voice low. Amira nodded. "There's a video." Sophie frowned. "What video?" "Of Eleanor. Someone edited the footage. They're twisting the story." Sophie's face went pale. She turned to her screen, typed the keywords, and within seconds found it. She watched in silence. The editing was ruthless, carefully selected phrases cut and rearranged to imply that Eleanor had been coached, that Sophie had orchestrated the moment for attention. The comments were worse. "Shame on this mother. Let kids be kids. She's using her child as a marketing ploy." She closed the tab. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. At exactly 10 o'clock, she entered the conference room. Inside were 3 people, Claudia Harper, a senior HR manager, and a legal advisor from compliance. "Ms. Reed," Claudia said calmly. "Thank you for coming." Sophie remained standing. "What is this?" Claudia gestured to a chair. "Please, sit." She did. "There's been a significant reaction online," Claudia began. "We believe it's best for you and for the company that we suspend your contract pending further review." Sophie's hands clenched in her lap. "Based on a video? Edited by someone with no connection to the company?" "This isn't about guilt or innocence," Claudia said. "It's about reputational risk. Sterling and Vale has always been apolitical, emotionally neutral. We can't afford to be caught in public narratives." "You mean messy ones," Sophie said quietly. Claudia folded her arms. "This isn't personal." "Yes, it is," Sophie replied. "You never wanted me here. This just gave you an excuse." The legal advisor cleared his throat. "We'll conduct a full internal review. You're not terminated, merely suspended." Sophie stood. "Does Mr. Lancaster know?" "He's been informed," Claudia said. Sophie gathered her things and left the room without another word. Back at her flat, Sophie sat at the kitchen table, staring at the folder she had once proudly handed to Edward Lancaster. The same folder Eleanor had carried into that lobby. Eleanor came in from school,
humming softly, her backpack bumping against the doorframe.
"Hi, Mum," she said brightly. Then she stopped. "What's wrong?" Sophie tried to smile. "I'm not going back to work tomorrow." "Why?"
"They think the video makes things complicated."
"But that wasn't your fault."
"I know." "Did they talk to you first? Ask you what happened?"
Sophie shook her head. "They didn't need to." Eleanor sat beside her. "That's not fair."
No, Sophia whispered.
"It's not." Eleanor looked down. "Maybe you should write another report. Prove them wrong again." Sophie blinked back tears. "I don't think another report will fix this."
Eleanor slid a small piece of paper across the table.
It was a note.
In uneven handwriting it read, "Dear Mr. Lancaster, my mum never lies. Please believe her."
"If you don't, who will?" Sophie stared at it for a long time.
Then she got up, walked to her bedroom, and pulled out her laptop. If they wouldn't listen to her as an employee, maybe they would listen to her as a mother.
As a woman. As a human being. She began to write.
Note à rebuttal.
Not a defense. But the truth.
And sometimes, truth was the loudest sound in the world. The office felt colder when Sophie returned, even though the thermostat hadn't changed. Her suspension had lasted only 4 days, but in the ruthless rhythm of Sterling and Vale, 4 days could stretch into a lifetime. She had been reinstated after a brief internal review concluded that she had not been involved in circulating or manipulating the viral video. The firm released a single sentence to the press: Ms. Reed's contract has been resumed following standard procedural review.
It said nothing. It explained nothing. Still, she returned. She kept her head down. Said little. Avoided eye contact with Claudia Harper. No one welcomed her back. Not officially. A few glances, a few silent nods. But she wasn't there for them. She was there for the work. Daniel greeted her with a quiet, "Glad you're back." Amira smiled. That was enough. She was reassigned to a new project almost immediately, codename Helios. A preliminary risk assessment on a multinational energy infrastructure deal involving a Japanese firm and a U.S. venture fund. Big money.
Big stakes. Edward Lancaster himself had greenlit the early analysis, requesting weekly briefings. Jonathan Clay was the executive sponsor. Claudia Harper, of course, was quietly watching everything. Sophie read through the preliminary documents carefully. Language translation. Contractual provision. Energy policy loophole. Data that spanned 3 time zones and 2 alphabets.
She loved it.
One afternoon, as she worked through the financial annexes, she received an email. From ken.tanaka@chincotechpartner.com. Subject, Elio, document clarification request.
Hi Sophie. Appreciate your diligence on Helios.
Before our call tomorrow, could you send over the internal exposure report you compiled? Would like to review your risk mapping in detail.
Thanks.
Ken. She stared at it for a moment. She had met Ken Tanaka only once, over video.
Polite.
Sharp. This seemed like a routine request.
She double-checked the address. Everything looked standard.
She attached the executive summary and replied, making sure to exclude any proprietary models or third-party references.
Nothing sensitive, she thought. Then she got back to work.
48 hours later, her building access card stopped working. The scanner blanked red.
She tried again.
Still nothing.
Behind her, someone cleared their throat.
A security guard.
Ms. Reed. Yes. I've been asked to escort you to HR. Her stomach tightened.
Upstairs, she was brought into a conference room. Claudia Harper was waiting, flanked by 2 members of the legal team.
Their faces were blank. Sophie sat down, her throat dry. What's this about? Claudia opened a folder.
We've discovered that an internal risk document regarding Project Helios was sent externally, without clearance. Sophie blinked.
I was asked to send it. By whom?
Ken Tanaka.
From Shinkotech.
Claudia slid a printed email across the table.
Is this the email?
Sophie glanced down.
It looked identical. Yes. Claudia looked at her. There is no Ken Tanaka employed at Shinkotech. Sophie stared at the paper. That's not possible. He was on a video call. He emailed before. Our IT department traced the email's origin, said the legal officer. It came from a VPN node in Birmingham. The domain was spoofed. It mimicked Shinkotech's domain but had a character replacement, an O replaced with a 0. It passed visual inspection but not digital verification. Sophie's heart pounded. I didn't notice. I thought. You sent a classified internal document to an unknown external source, Claudia said evenly. At best, this is negligence. At worst, it's a breach. I didn't send any models.
Juste à ce mari.
High level. That's not the point, Claudia snapped. You were on probation. You were warned about reputational risk. Now there's operational risk. I thought it was a valid request. I checked the name. You didn't check the metadata, said the legal officer. Sophie looked at him, then at Claudia. You think I did this on purpose? We're not here to make assumptions, Claudia replied. We're here to protect the company. She stood. Effective immediately, your access is suspended pending a full investigation. Any further communication must go through legal counsel. Sophie stood as well. Her legs were unsteady. Edward doesn't know about this, she said. Claudia's mouth curled slightly. Mr. Lancaster trusts his departments to handle procedural matters.
The message was clear.
She was on her own. That evening, Sophie sat at the dining table, the same one where she had once written her application, where Eleanor had done her homework and drawn stick figures in crayon. The email was printed out, lying flat before her. It looked genuine. It read like any of the dozens of emails she'd fielded in her past career. She had read it too fast, perhaps.
Trusted too easily.
Or maybe she had been tired. Distracted. Human. Eleanor came in quietly, placed a glass of water beside her.
You're not going back tomorrow. Sophie shook her head.
Eleanor bit her lip. Did they fire you? Not yet. Are they being fair? Sophie didn't answer. Eleanor climbed onto the chair beside her. You're not a bad person, she said. I know. You didn't try to hurt anyone. I know. Silence passed between them. Then Eleanor asked, Are you going to fight? Sophie looked at her. Do you think I should? Eleanor nodded. They can't win just because they have more people. You have the truth. Sophie reached over, pulled her daughter into her arms, and held her tightly. I'm scared, she whispered. Me too, Eleanor said. But I'm not quitting, Sophie said quietly. Not again. Down at Sterling and Vale, in a darkened conference room, Edward Lancaster sat alone, rewatching the video of Sophie's presentation on the Gemini project from weeks earlier. Her voice, steady and precise. Her logic, impeccable. He had known something like this might happen. Claudia had warned him. Jonathan had nodded politely. Risk always lingered when you chose to go against the grain. But something about this didn't sit right. He opened his laptop, pulled up the internal server log, and typed a search, Tanaka. There it was. A VPN trail. A suspicious IP. Logged access from inside the Sterling and Vale network prior to the spoofed email. Edward's jaw clenched. It hadn't been an outsider. It had been planted. Someone wanted Sophie out. He stared at the screen for a long time. And then he made a decision. It was time to stop watching. It was time to act. The next morning, Edward Lancaster arrived at the office earlier than usual. The rain had cleared, but the skies above London still hung heavy, like a verdict waiting to fall. He entered without his assistant, ignored the messages stacked in his inbox, and went straight to the internal compliance division. No one expected to see the CEO there. The head of IT security, a cautious man named Declan Moore, was reviewing a network usage report when Edward appeared at his door. I need your help, Edward said, without preamble. Declan blinked, stood. Of course, sir. What's the issue? An email was sent to Sophie Reed from what appeared to be a partner at Shinkotech. The address was a spoof. Yes, we flagged that. Legal's handling it now. Not fast enough, Edward said. I've seen the access logs.
That email wasn't generated externally. It originated through a backdoor entry. Someone inside our network created it.
I want to know who. Declan hesitated. Sir, if you're suggesting there was deliberate sabotage.
I'm not suggesting, Edward said coldly.
I'm stating.
And I want the truth, not the version Claudia Harper reports.
Declan straightened. Understood. I'll begin a trace immediately.
Edward gave him a curt nod and left, his jaw set. For too long, he had built Sterling and Vale on the premise that efficiency outweighed sentiment, that performance could be measured in numbers alone. But people like Claudia had taken that doctrine and turned it into a shield, for cruelty, exclusion, and quiet sabotage.
No more.
That same morning, Sophie sat on a park bench near her daughter's school, watching Eleanor chase a flock of pigeons with another child. She had not yet told Eleanor she might not return to Sterling and Vale. But children sensed things. Eleanor had drawn her a card the night before. On the front was a stick figure wearing a crown and holding a laptop. Inside, in careful handwriting, were the words, "Dear Mr. Lancaster, my mum is the bravest person I know. She helps people even when they don't deserve it. Please listen to her. The world is better when she's working." Sophie hadn't planned to deliver the letter. But now she wasn't so sure. In the afternoon, Declan returned to Edward's office, visibly unsettled. "We found it," he said. The spoofed email was created using a shadow profile within the internal HR system. Someone with administrative clearance used a mirrored identity template and relayed the message through a proxy network. Edward folded his arms. Who? Declan hesitated. It originated from Claudia Harper's terminal. Specifically, her assistant's login credentials. Edward's eyes narrowed. Intentional. Highly. The mirrored identity was used to fabricate multiple internal communications, timed perfectly with the Helios project cycle. Edward nodded slowly. "I want copies of everything. Forward it to my private line. And do not, under any circumstance, inform HR." Declan left. Edward stared at the Thames through his office window. The water looked calm, but beneath it, the current moved relentlessly. It was time to pull people to the surface. That evening, Amira Patel knocked gently on Sophie's door. Sophie, still in jeans and a sweater, opened it with a weary smile. "I brought tea," Amira said, holding up a thermos. Sophie stepped aside. "You didn't have to." "I know. But I wanted to." They sat in the living room while Eleanor worked on homework in the corner. Amira poured the tea, then looked at Sophie carefully. "There are people inside the company who believe in you," she said. "I don't think that matters anymore," Sophie replied. "It does," Amira said. "Because we've had enough of people like Claudia controlling everything from the shadows." Sophie looked at her. "You're taking a risk just by being here." "So are you," Amira said. "Every time you tell the truth." Sophie hesitated, then reached into her bag and handed her the letter Eleanor had written. "I don't know if I'm foolish for holding on to things like this," she said. Amira read the note. Smiled.
No.
"This is why we fight." She stood, placed the card gently on the table, and looked at Sophie. "I'm going to start gathering names. Employees who've been shut out, passed over, demoted for reasons that don't make sense. I think you'll find you're not the only one." Sophie's voice was quiet. "And then what?" "Then," Amira said, "we tell the story. Together." By the end of the week, Edward had received a list. Over 30 employees had experienced similar patterns of treatment: files rejected for minor gaps, performance reviews downgraded without explanation, quiet exits masked as personal choice. He read every line. He read Eleanor's note again, which had appeared anonymously on his desk 2 days earlier. And then, on Friday morning, he called a meeting of the senior executive team. The room was full. Claudia Harper sat directly across from him, composed and confident. "We've completed the internal review into the Helios document leak," Edward began. "The results are illuminating." He tapped the table. A screen behind him lit up, showing a detailed log of the shadow account activity. Not only was the email spoofed using company systems, he continued, but it was coordinated using access privileges traced directly to HR terminals. A few gasps. A few glances. Claudia's expression did not change. I trust this is being handled internally, she said. Edward met her gaze. It is. And it will be handled transparently. He turned to the others. But more importantly, this incident has revealed something deeper. A culture of fear, of silent exclusion, has taken root in this company. We claim to value talent without conditions. But our actions have proven otherwise. Jonathan Clay shifted in his seat. Edward's voice grew quieter. If we do not fix this, we become exactly what our critics accuse us of, a machine that eats people and rewards silence. He stood. Sophie Reed will be reinstated immediately, with full rights and retroactive compensation. Claudia's mouth parted slightly. I'm also placing the HR department under formal audit, effective immediately, Edward added. And Claudia, I'll need your full cooperation. For the first time, Claudia looked uncertain. The room was silent. Then Edward said more softly, we forgot that being excellent isn't about being flawless. It's about being honest. And brave. Sophie received the call from Edward directly. I've wronged you, he said. You were misled, she replied. That doesn't make it right. No, she said. But it makes it human. He paused. I'd like you to speak at our next all-staff meeting. Not just about Helios, but about what it means to be underestimated. Sophie glanced at Eleanor, who was grinning from across the room. I think I can do that, she said. The announcement went out company-wide on Monday morning, all-staff forum, 4 p.m. sharp. Attendance mandatory. Speaker, Sophie Reed. That alone was enough to start a storm of speculation. Sophie had never spoken to the company at large. She was a contractor, a quiet figure in the margins of spreadsheets and late-night revision notes. And yet, now her name was pinned to the highest visibility event of the quarter. By 3:30, the auditorium on the ground floor was filling quickly. People whispered in groups near the back, others filed into rows with guarded curiosity. Daniel Wells sat near the aisle, arms folded. Amira sat toward the front, flanked by 2 junior analysts she had personally invited. Even Oliver, the junior from Amira's team, had brought 3 colleagues from Risk. At 3:55, the executives entered. Edward Lancaster took his seat in the front row. Claudia Hopper followed, her expression blank, hands clasped too tightly in her lap. Jonathan Clay leaned casually in his chair, as though he were watching a rehearsal rather than a reckoning. At 4 o'clock, Sophie stepped onto the stage. She wore no blazer.
No designer's shoes.
Just a navy blouse, dark trousers, and a calm steadiness in her gaze. Her hair was pulled back.
No makeup. No theatrics.
The room quieted instantly. She looked out at hundreds of faces. People who hadn't known her name 2 weeks ago. People who had judged her, defended her, doubted her, ignored her. They were all here now. I was told this would be a good time to explain myself, she began, her voice amplified but unforced. But I'm not going to do that. There was a pause. I'm not here to defend or resume, or justify how long I've been away from the workforce, or prove I didn't leak a document someone else forged. Because those things already happened. And the truth eventually surfaced, without a perfect pitch or a well-timed presentation. She stepped forward slightly. I'm here because for the last 3 months, I've watched something quietly unravel inside this company. And not just to me. To dozens of people. Maybe hundreds. People with unconventional paths, with career gaps, with different accents, or family names that don't echo privilege. People who weren't seen, not really, because someone decided they didn't fit. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. In a company like this, people don't get shouted out of rooms. They get silently passed over. Files go unopened. Interviews get politely cancelled. Ideas don't get shot down, they just vanish. She paused. I came here hoping for a job. But I stayed because I thought something better might be possible. And despite everything, I still believe that. Not because I trust the system, but because I've seen what happens when people stand inside the cracks and say, this isn't working. She turned slightly, gesturing to the screen behind her. It lit up, not with data charts or performance metrics, but with a single phrase, talent without conditions. 3 words, she said. A policy. A promise. And for a while, just a slogan.
But if we mean it, if we really mean it, it has to apply to people like me. People like the dozens of employees who were passed over not for lack of skill, but because someone decided their path wasn't polished enough.
Her voice remained steady. I'm not asking for applause. I'm asking for accountability.
She nodded to Edward, who rose from his seat and joined her on stage.
Edward took the microphone.
Sophie's not exaggerating, he said. An internal audit revealed repeated patterns of selective rejection and silent exclusion.
Not one or two mistakes, systemic behavior. That's not who we say we are. And it cannot be who we become. He turned to the crowd. I've made mistakes.
By letting policies get interpreted in ways that harm instead of help.
I believed silence meant efficiency. But silence is often a symptom of fear. He looked down briefly, then continued.
We will be instituting a transparent appeals process for rejected applications, creating an independent ethics council, and placing all major departmental decisions under monthly review.
This starts today. A slow murmur of surprise rose from the crowd.
Then, cautious but distinct, came the sound of clapping, first from Amira, then Daniel, then others.
Within seconds, the auditorium was filled with it. Not thunderous, but steady. Sophie didn't smile.
She simply stepped back, allowing the moment to belong to everyone. After the forum, employees lingered in the atrium. Conversations sparked that hadn't happened in months, some personal, some professional, many long overdue. Claudia Hopper stood in a corner by the elevator, staring straight ahead.
Her face was unreadable, but her shoulders were tense. She knew what was coming. The audit findings were being finalized.
Edward had already requested a closed-door meeting with the board. Her reign was ending, not with a dramatic firing, but with a slow withdrawal of power.
Jonathan Clay, for his part, retreated quietly. He had miscalculated.
Edward's loyalty had always leaned toward control, but control, as it turned out, could shift with enough truth. In her small flat later that night, Sophie curled up on the sofa with Eleanor. The girl was half asleep, her head resting on her mother's lap.
Did they clap? She mumbled. Sophie brushed a strand of hair from Eleanor's face. Yes. Did they believe you? I think so. Good, Eleanor whispered. Because I did. Sophie looked out the window. The city lights blinked like quiet signals in the dark. She had not planned to speak. Had never wanted a spotlight.
But somehow, standing there, she had remembered what it felt like to believe in your own voice again. To not just survive, but to insist that survival had meaning. She kissed the top of Eleanor's head and whispered thank you. For giving her the reason. For reminding her that courage was not always loud, it was sometimes as simple as telling the truth when it was easier to stay quiet. And in that moment, with no applause, no audience, and no performance, Sophie Reed felt something she hadn't felt in years.
Whole.
The week after the all-staff meeting, the energy at Sterling and Vale felt unfamiliar.
Lighter in places. Tense in others.
Conversations that had once been whispered were now held in open corners. HR forms were restructured, new feedback channels rolled out. It wasn't a revolution, but it was motion. For Sophie, it felt like standing in the middle of a great unraveling. Threads once tightly wound around her, doubt, fear, invisibility, had loosened.
Not entirely, but enough to breathe. Enough to move. She hadn't expected to stay. Not really.
She had thought the speech might be her final act, the one thing she'd leave behind before exiting quietly.
Instead, her inbox had filled with requests. Not offers. Invitations.
A group in sustainability wanted her perspective on inclusive policy writing. A regional division in Europe asked her to weigh in on leadership design. Even the board had sent a formal note of acknowledgement, signed and stamped. But amidst the attention, Sophie kept her rhythm simple.
She worked. She parented. She rested. And she waited. It was Edward Lancaster who reached out next. Coffee, his message read. Tomorrow. Just us.
They met in a small cafe near the river.
No assistance.
No security.
He arrived 5 minutes early, ordered a plain black coffee, and sat by the window. Sophie entered just after, still wearing her work ID clipped to her coat. They nodded in greeting, neither offering small talk at first. After a pause, Edward said, "You changed things."
Sophie sipped her tea.
No.
Things were already changing. I just made them visible. He considered that. That's what leadership is, though. Naming what others try to ignore. Sophie gave a faint smile. You don't strike me as someone who likes to share the stage.
Edward looked out the window for a moment, then said, When I was 33, I lost my wife and daughter in a car accident.
A rainy night. Wrong lane.
I spent the next 17 years building something big enough to bury that grief under.
Sophie sat still. He went on. I told myself structure was salvation. If I made rules strong enough, I could keep chaos out. But all I did was replace grief with distance. And distance breeds people like Claudia. Sophie spoke gently. Distance isn't weakness. It's survival. But survival isn't the same as healing. Edward looked at her. You sound like someone who's done both. I'm trying. He nodded. And what do you want now? Sophie paused. A role where I can build, not defend. Something strategic. Long-term. But I also want space. For Eleanor. For myself. Edward considered her. I want to offer you a permanent role. Head of ethical strategy. You'd report directly to me. Design systems that protect people, not just profits. Rebuild what we lost. Sophie's breath caught. Not because of the title, but because he had meant it. Fully. Quietly. Without pressure. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she asked, What happens to Claudia? She's being offered a transfer to an external consulting post. No public drama. But no more power here. And Jonathan? He's smart enough to know when the tide turns. Sophie stirred her tea. Then maybe it's time for me to stop surviving too. She didn't accept the role that day. She asked for a weekend. And he gave it to her. That Saturday, Sophie and Eleanor took a train to the coast. The sky was clear, the air full of salt. They walked along the shore, shoes in hand, waves brushing their ankles. Mum. Eleanor asked as they sat on a smooth patch of sand. Are you going to work there forever? Sophie smiled. I don't know. Maybe not forever. Do you like it now? I like what it could become. But I don't want it to be the only thing I am. Eleanor picked up a shell. You're my mum. That's the biggest job. Sophie laughed. Yes. That one I'm keeping. They sat quietly, the wind tugging at their sleeves. Then Eleanor said, I want to help people when I grow up. Like you did. You already do, Sophie said. You helped me. Eleanor leaned against her. I like when we're just here.
No screens. No emails.
Sophie nodded. Me too.
That night, back at their flat, Sophie opened her laptop, drafted a short email, and sent it. Subject, Ethical Strategy Position. Edward. Thank you for the offer. I accept, with one condition. This role cannot be about me. It must be about us. A team. A policy shift. A legacy. Let's build that together. Sophie. When she returned to the office Monday morning, her nameplate had been changed. Sophie Reed, Director, Ethical Strategy and Inclusion.
No spotlight. No ceremony.
Just a quiet truth taking root in an organization that, at last, had begun to listen. As she stepped into her new office, she noticed a framed note sitting on the desk. Eleanor's letter. The one she had written weeks ago. Edward had framed it. Sophie smiled, placed her bag down, and turned on her screen. There was work to do. Real work. And for the first time in a long time, she wasn't starting from scratch. She was building forward. 6 months passed. The name Sophie Reed was no longer a whispered question in the hallways of Stirling and Vale. It was spoken with familiarity, even respect. People now said things like "That's Sophie's initiative," or "Run it by Sophie" before final sign-off. She was no longer a contractor in the margins. She was part of the blueprint. But she had not become the center. That was deliberate. Sophie built her department like a web, quiet, interconnected, resilient. She brought in people who had once been passed over, a financial analyst who'd left for caregiving reasons, a policy advisor with a visible disability, a woman returning after 10 years raising 3 children. Their ideas weren't always the loudest in the room, but they stuck. Because they were rooted in experience, in perspective, in life. The new Ethical Strategy Division didn't just review policies. It rewrote them. Every job description was stripped of unnecessary jargon. Every hiring panel required multiple perspectives. Every rejected applicant received feedback, not a generic line, but something real. They didn't fix the company overnight. No one does. But they tilted the arc. And others noticed. Investors began asking questions not just about quarterly numbers, but about culture metrics. Sterling and Vale's internal survey, once a box-ticking exercise, now became a living document, fuel for reform. The results still weren't perfect. But they were honest. And that mattered.
Still, Sophie never forgot how it had started. A red satchel.
A manila folder.
A little girl who refused to accept a no that hadn't been fairly earned. On the 1-year anniversary of her return to work, Sophie stood once again on the stage of the all-staff auditorium.
Note for drama. Note for redemption. For progress.
She wore the same navy blouse. Her speech was short. We don't need to be perfect, she said. But we do need to be responsible. And we have to remember that behind every resume, every application, every decision we make, there is a life. A person. A story. Then she paused. I know, because mine was nearly erased. The room was silent. Not in disinterest.
In understanding.
When she stepped off stage, Edward Lancaster was waiting by the side door. He looked older these days.
Less like a statue and more like a man.
Good speech, he said quietly. It wasn't a speech, she replied. It was a reminder. He nodded. Are you happy? He asked.
Sophie thought about that.
I'm at peace. That's better. They didn't need to say more. The war had ended long ago. Now it was about what they built from its ashes. That evening, Sophie and Eleanor walked home along the south bank.
The city shimmered in the blue dusk, bridge glowing softly above the river. Eleanor was still now. A little more serious.
But her eyes still held that same spark. Mum. Yes. Do you ever wish it had happened differently? Sophie looked at her. What do you mean? If they just said yes the first time.
No viral video.
No speech. No mess. Sophie smiled. Sometimes.
But if they had, I wouldn't have known what I was capable of.
Or what you were.
Eleanor grinned. I was pretty brave. You were more than brave. They walked a few more steps. Do you think other people will get their chances now? Eleanor asked. I think some will, Sophie said. Because you showed them it was possible. Me? You, Sophie nodded.
You started something.
They reached their building. Eleanor ran ahead, up the steps, then turned back.
You're still not done, are you?
Sophie paused. No. Not yet. Then she followed.
Somewhere across the city, a woman in her 50s sat staring at a computer screen. She had just finished typing her resume for the first time in 9 years. A friend had sent her a link to a new recruitment platform, one built by Sterling and Vale's Ethical Strategy Division. It encouraged applicants to include life experience, not just work experience. It asked questions about growth, about values, about resilience.
She hesitated. Then she clicked submit.
The screen blanked.
Thank you for your story. It was only a form. But it felt like something more. A beginning.
In a quiet room on the top floor of Sterling and Vale, Edward Lancaster sat at his desk. He held a handwritten note, the edges worn soft from use. The same note Sophie's daughter had once left on his desk. He read it again.
My mom never lies. Please believe her.
If you don't, who will? He didn't frame it. He didn't display it. He just kept it close.
Because in all the years he had led companies, closed deals, built empires, no one had ever asked him that question so simply.
If you don't, who will?
It was still the most honest question he'd ever received.
And in the end, it had changed him. Just as it had changed everything. Epilogue.
Years later, the story of Sophie Reed was sometimes told in leadership seminars, ethics workshops, even HR conferences.
People called it a case study. Some turned it into a lesson.
Un modèle.
A cautionary tale. But Eleanor told it differently. To her, it was never about a scandal or a strategy. It was about a woman who didn't ask for power, but found it when she told the truth. About a girl who carried her mother's hope in a folder too big for her arms. About how change doesn't always come from the top down, but from the bottom up, from the quiet, from the overlooked, from the ones with nothing to lose.
And everything to give.
Sophie Reed never wrote a memoir. But in offices and hallways, in rewritten policies and changed lives, her story was written anyway. Not in bold headlines, but in bold choices. And sometimes, that's all the world needs. Not a hero.
Just someone brave enough to speak.